I suppose there will be people who disagree with this statement. However, based on my own experience, I could say that it is precisely the evaluation of the 57mm anti-tank gun model 1941, which is most often called by the factory index IS-2, that gives rise to the greatest number of disagreements and disputes, to be more precise. In this case, we are talking about two slightly different variants of this gun, the 1941 model and the 1943 model. And although, strictly speaking, these are two different guns, moreover, their developers are also formally different. Graben was engaged in the creation of the S-37 gun at the TCKB, while the specialists working at Plant No. 92 were engaged in the refinement of the ZIS-2. We will consider them together as a single whole, since in the context of this discussion, the difference between these two modifications is not critical or decisive. So, what is the main reason for such heated and lengthy debates? As is often the case, all Soviet weapon samples from the Second World War are described in exceptionally superb and enthusiastic tones, without skimping on the use of exclamation marks. About airplanes, about tanks, and of course about guns, it is boldly stated that they were the best in the world, that their opponents and allies gave them a very high assessment and even made efforts to copy them or put them into service. Such a simplified, I would even say primitive black and white approach is certainly harmful, since it contains many contradictions and, ultimately, does not allow us to recreate an objective and reliable picture of the events of the past. And on the specific example of the 57mm gun, all these features and nuances can be traced with sufficient clarity. Let's start by looking at the positive aspects, namely the undeniable fact that the design of this gun itself was, without any doubt, very, very successful. This, in turn, is explained by the fact that the development of the gun was carried out over a relatively long period of time, and in addition, it was based on a very successful artillery system, deserving all praise. Let me remind you that the Design Bureau of Plant No. 92 was created primarily for the purpose of refining and introducing into mass production artillery guns developed on the basis of the field gun of the Swedish company Bofors. Initially, it was planned to launch the Swedish gun itself into mass production. However, in the end, only one prototype was produced. In general, the design of the Bofors was completely copied by the specialists of Graben's Design Bureau in an experimental gun, which received the Index F-20, after which they continued its refinement and improvement. As a result, a successful design was created, which later formed the basis for the vast majority of pre-war artillery systems developed by Graben's Design Bureau. The first sample in this series was the 76mm regimental gun F-24, which, however, was never adopted for service. Actually, it was in this design, which had undergone certain refinements and improvements, that a 57mm barrel was installed, the length of which was as many as 73 calibers. In addition, a very powerful and effective ammunition was developed, which used the case from the 76mm 3-inch. We ask you to subscribe to our channel, give a like, so that you can hear many more interesting stories about the Second World War and the opinions of all participants about certain events. As a result, the armor-piercing projectile, which weighed 19 kg, had an initial velocity of 990 meters per second, and the subcaliber projectile accelerated to a speed of more than 1,000 meters per second. The tabular armor penetration at a distance of 500 meters was an impressive 85 to 90 millimeters, which was an excellent indicator for that time. This, of course, was more than enough to confidently hit any tanks that were in service in all countries at that time. At the same time, in that specific historical period, there was nothing in the arsenals of other countries even remotely similar to the Soviet 57mm gun. The only comparable analog at that time was the 5cm anti-tank gun Pak 38, which was in service with the Wehrmacht, but it was still significantly inferior to the Soviet gun in such an important indicator as armor penetration, although it had less mass. But, as is often the case, there was unfortunately a fly in the ointment in this barrel of honey. Unfortunately, it was not possible to establish mass production of this gun. The manufacture of such a long barrel turned out to be an extremely difficult and labor-intensive technological task, and as a result, a significant part of the manufactured products went to waste. No less difficulties and complications arose when crimping the case from the 76mm 3-inch to a caliber of 57mm. As a result, we get the following extremely unpleasant situation. The war is going on. German tank wedges are rapidly advancing deep into Soviet territory, and a certain, with your permission, brilliant strategist has made, to put it mildly, a short-sighted decision to stop the production of 45mm anti-tank guns, the so-called 45s back in 1940. Thus, it turns out that there was practically nothing with which to hit German tanks. Any peace production of such wonderful and effective 57mm guns in the conditions of the unfolding war was, to put it simply, a deadly thing, and as a result, it was decided to stop their production. As an explanation and cover for their own stupidity, a fairy tale was invented about excessive power, which some, unfortunately, still manage to repeat without even trying to think about the obvious absurdity. To think about the fact that the concept of excessive power in this particular case is absolutely inappropriate and illogical, especially in a situation where the army has practically no effective means to fight enemy tanks. Therefore, it is completely wrong and irrational to reason and talk about any best gun that was practically not present in the troops, only 200 guns on the scale of the huge Eastern Front. This is just ridiculous and absurd. You can invent anything, but if this anything cannot fully manifest itself in real combat conditions for whatever reasons, then it essentially ceases to be a weapon. And if it is impossible to saturate and provide troops with anti-tank guns, then it is at the very least frivolous and stupid to talk about them in some kind of superlative tone. Yes, of course, in 1943, a completely justified decision was made to resume the production of the 57mm gun. And this decision was dictated not by a good life, but rather by a desperate need. New German tanks appeared on the battlefield, such as the Tigers, and other German armored vehicles began to have more powerful armor. By that time, 45mm anti-tank guns were no longer considered a serious and effective means of fighting tanks. 76mm field guns were also unable to fight them effectively, and were completely useless against new tanks. There is data on tests of various Soviet, British, and American artillery systems, which were carried out at a training ground by firing at a captured German Tiger tank. The 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun was able to penetrate the 82mm side of the tank hull from a distance of 1,000 meters, and this was achieved by only one of the two fired projectiles. Hits on the frontal plates of the hull from a distance of 500 meters did not lead to penetration. The result was only dents, the depth of which varied from 20 to 65 millimeters, but at the same time, the destruction of welds was noted. The 57mm British anti-tank gun was able to penetrate the 82mm side of the tank hull from a distance of 1,000 meters, and the side of the turret from a distance of 800 meters. At the same time, two projectiles fired at the side of the turret from 1,000 meters could not penetrate it. Two shots were fired from the 57mm British tank gun Mk3, which was mounted on the Churchill tank, at the 82mm side wall of the hull from a distance of 625 meters. The first hit led to armor penetration, and the second hit the edge of the sheet, and therefore it was not counted. The 76mm F-34 tank gun was fired using 4 different types of ammunition: standard armor-piercing tracer, experimental cumulative, subcaliber, and armor-piercing solid-body projectiles. As a result, the 82mm armor was not penetrated even from a distance of 200 meters, and shelling of 62mm sheets was not carried out at all. From the 85mm anti-aircraft gun, the 82mm side of the hull was penetrated from a distance of 1450 meters, and the lower frontal sheet from a distance of 1,000 meters. I will not cite other results for the sake of saving time. As we can see against the Tiger tank, our 57mm gun was clearly too weak, In the frontal projection, it did not take it, and letting the tank approach at a distance of less than 500 meters was, in most cases, almost certain death. Thus, despite the fact that in 1943, thanks to the use of specially supplied Lend-Lease equipment, the production of ZIS-2 was still resumed, the finest hour for this gun had already irrevocably passed. 1943 was the time when guns with a caliber of 75 to 76 millimeters were no longer considered powerful and effective enough. And German designers were working on the creation of not only 88 millimeters, but also 105 to 128 millimeters anti-tank guns, which were much more powerful and destructive. However, it is certainly necessary to be happy with what we have, as can be seen from the above data. The 57mm guns, which were still at our disposal, were without any doubt better than the most massive 76mm guns. However, there is not much to be happy about, since it was not possible to establish mass production of ZIS-2 again in 1943 to 1944. Only 4,380 guns were produced. And for the huge needs of the anti-tank artillery of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, these were, of course, meager crumbs. Therefore, arguing and discussing that the Soviet 57mm anti-tank gun, in terms of its tactical and technical characteristics, was one of the best guns in its class, simply has no practical meaning. In some aspects, it was superior, and in others, on the contrary, it was inferior to other similar artillery systems, but characteristics alone are not enough. It is necessary that the gun can actually fight and operate effectively on the battlefield. And although in the publicly available online encyclopedia Wikipedia you can find such a statement, the 57mm ZIS-2 gun, according to the assessment of American specialists, was considered the best medium anti-tank gun of the Second World War. But from all these so-called American specialists, one can find only a far from the most authoritative author of a rather controversial reference book on artillery, a certain Mr. Jan Hogg. It should be noted that nothing is known about any tests of the Soviet 57mm gun in the United States of America at all. Most likely, it got there as a trophy during the Korean War or some other war. By the way, this gun is still in service in some countries in Africa and South America. Well, and it seems it also remained in the arsenal of the Yemeni Houthis. This is such a rather ambiguous and confusing story with this 57mm gun, about which a huge number of disputes are being conducted, and apparently they will continue for a long time. Goodbye. We were glad to see you on our channel. Don't forget to write comments, give likes, and subscribe to the channel.